Time magazine may have just handed Prince Harry one of the biggest honors of his post-royal life, but at the exact same moment, a completely different story was exploding behind the scenes, and that story threatens to turn a victory lap into a public relations nightmare. Because while Harry was being celebrated as the #1 leader in sport on the planet, a wounded veteran who once became one of the faces of the Invictus Games was reportedly sitting in Canada wondering why nobody from Invictus or Harry himself would answer his calls. And suddenly, the question isn't about awards, it's about accountability. The timing is almost impossible to ignore. One headline painted Harry as a global sports leader above some of the biggest athletic legends in history, above champions whose names have become synonymous with excellence, above icons who spent decades dominating their fields. And yet critics immediately started asking the same uncomfortable question: how exactly did Prince Harry end up at the top of that list? Because unlike the athletes surrounding him, Harry has never built a professional sporting career. His recognition came through Invictus, through leadership, through the image of a prince devoted to wounded veterans, through a narrative carefully built over years. And that narrative suddenly collided with a story that looked very different. For years, Invictus has been presented as Harry's crowning achievement, his greatest success story, the project that proved he could build something meaningful outside palace walls. Whenever criticism followed him, Invictus remained the shield, the one initiative even many critics respected, the one place where Harry appeared focused, passionate, and committed. But what happens when a veteran at the heart of that mission starts raising questions? What happens when the spotlight shifts away from speeches and ceremonies and lands on what happened after the camera stopped rolling? That is where the name Scott Snow enters the story. Scott Snow was not some anonymous participant buried deep inside Invictus Records. He wasn't a forgotten competitor standing in the background. He was one of the faces chosen to represent the games. Invictus selected him, promoted him, featured him, used his remarkable journey to inspire audiences and demonstrate exactly what the organization claimed to stand for. His story embodied sacrifice, resilience, and determination, everything Invictus wanted the world to see. Snow spent 15 years serving in the Canadian Armed Forces, dangerous assignments, grueling responsibilities, years of sacrifice. By the time he arrived at the 2023 Invictus Games in Düsseldorf, his body had already endured 14 surgeries connected to injuries sustained during military service. 14. Think about that number. Most people would struggle to recover from one. Yet Snow kept fighting, kept rebuilding, kept moving forward. But perhaps the most emotional detail involved his daughters. According to reports, Snow wanted them to see him in uniform one final time, one final proud moment, one final chance to show them the man he had been before years of injuries reshaped his life. He described Invictus as a final chapter, a farewell, a swan song. It was supposed to be a celebration of perseverance. Instead, according to reports, it became the beginning of another painful ordeal. During competition, Snow reportedly suffered a devastating fall while participating in a wheelchair event. At first, adrenaline did what adrenaline often does. It masked the damage. It convinced him he could continue. It convinced him he could push through. Veterans are trained to endure pain, to finish missions, to keep going. And that's exactly what he reportedly did. But later, concerns began growing. Reports claim medical evaluation on site failed to identify the full severity of the injury. No imaging, no detailed scans, no urgent intervention. Instead, Snow was reportedly advised to take things easy and monitor his condition. What seemed manageable in the moment would later become something far more serious. And then comes the detail that left many observers stunned. Snow was reportedly placed on a commercial flight and sent home to Canada, a veteran with a potentially serious spinal injury, an individual already carrying the physical burden of 14 previous surgeries, an athlete who had just been featured as a symbol of Invictus resilience, flying home across the Atlantic, sitting in an economy seat. The image alone is enough to make people pause, enough to trigger questions, enough to create a wave of scrutiny that refuses to disappear. Because if Invictus exists to support wounded veterans, critics ask, what happened here? How did things unfold this way? Who made these decisions? And why do so many questions remain unanswered? Back in Canada, the situation reportedly became even worse. Tingling sensations, medical concerns, growing alarm. Eventually, further examinations allegedly revealed severe severe spinal injuries that had not been fully recognized immediately after the accident. Surgeries followed. Recovery became another battle. And suddenly, the story was no longer about competition. It was about consequences. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. On one side of the world, Prince Harry was being praised as an inspirational leader. On the other side, one of Invictus's most recognizable veterans was reportedly navigating a painful medical crisis while seeking answers. The two stories collided like opposing realities, one celebrating leadership, the other questioning whether that leadership truly showed up when it mattered most. And that is where this story stops being merely embarrassing and starts looking deeply damaging. Because according to reports, Scott Snow didn't simply recover quietly and move on. He allegedly tried to reach out again and again, not just to people connected to Invictus, but reportedly to Prince Harry's office as well. A man whose image had helped promote the games. A man whose story had been showcased to the public. A man who believed the organization he represented would stand beside him after his injury. Yet according to the reporting, the response he encountered was something far more troubling: silence. Complete silence. That allegation became the emotional center of the controversy. Not the injury itself, not the surgeries, not even the questions about medical care. It was the silence. Because silence has a strange way of amplifying every other question. Silence creates suspicion. Silence invites speculation. Silence allows critics to fill in blanks with their own conclusions. And suddenly people began asking whether Invictus had become more focused on appearances than accountability. For years, Prince Harry has spoken passionately about wounded veterans, about purpose, about identity, about belonging. Those themes appear repeatedly in speeches, interviews, documentaries, and public appearances. They form the foundation of the Invictus brand. The idea that injured service members are not forgotten, that they matter, that someone is fighting for them, which is exactly why this story struck such a nerve. Because if even a fraction of these allegations are accurate, critics argue the gap between rhetoric and reality suddenly looks enormous. The controversy only intensified because it arrived during Harry's moment of celebration. Had this emerged months earlier, perhaps it would have faded quietly. Had it emerged months later, perhaps fewer people would have connected the dots, but the overlap was impossible to ignore. One headline proclaimed Harry an extraordinary leader. Another questioned whether leadership had disappeared precisely when it was needed most. One story spoke about inspiration. The other spoke about unanswered calls. One highlighted prestige. The other highlighted pain. And then came broader concerns already surrounding Invictus. Questions about sponsorships. Questions about priorities. Questions about celebrity attention overshadowing veterans themselves. Critics have increasingly argued that discussions surrounding the games often focus more on Harry and Meghan than on the wounded service members participating. Whether fair or unfair, those criticisms already existed. The Scott Snow controversy simply poured fuel onto a fire that was already burning. What makes this especially uncomfortable is that nobody disputes the power of the original Invictus concept. Even many critics acknowledge that. The idea remains inspiring. Veterans competing, veterans healing, veterans rebuilding confidence and purpose. The emotional impact is undeniable. That isn't what people are questioning. What they're questioning is whether the organization has remained faithful to that mission as its profile has grown larger and more glamorous. And perhaps that is the real scandal hiding beneath the headlines. Not whether Prince Harry deserves an award, not whether Time magazine made the right choice, but whether leadership is measured by speeches and ceremonies or by what happens when a struggling veteran needs help behind closed doors. Because leadership sounds impressive on a magazine cover. Leadership looks wonderful during acceptance speeches. Leadership photographs beautifully. But real leadership becomes visible during uncomfortable moments, during crises, during failures, during situations nobody wants to discuss. Now critics are demanding answers. Who received Snow's communications? Why weren't concerns addressed publicly? Was Harry aware of the situation? If not, why not? And if he was aware, why was there reportedly no response? Those questions continue hanging over the entire controversy like dark clouds gathering before a storm. Perhaps those answers will eventually come. Perhaps someone will finally speak. Perhaps Invictus will address the allegations directly. Perhaps Harry himself will respond. But until that happens, two competing images remain locked in a collision course. One image shows a prince standing proudly among accolades, celebrated as a world-class leader. The other shows a wounded veteran reportedly waiting for a phone call that never came. And the uncomfortable truth is that the public is now staring at both images simultaneously. The award may have created headlines, but the unanswered questions are creating something far more dangerous. Because awards eventually gather dust, magazine covers disappear, public praise fades. But stories stories involving wounded veterans, broken trust, and alleged silence have a habit of lingering long after the applause ends. And right now, that lingering question continues echoing louder than any celebration. If Invictus was built to support veterans, then why does one of its most recognizable veterans reportedly feel abandoned? That mystery remains unresolved, and until it isn't, this story may be far from over.